It's really up to Speaker Pelosi and Leader Schumer to figure out how to get this done in Congress. What I can tell you is that it's utterly essential that this be done. I've said that by the 18th of October, we will be out of extraordinary measures, have limited cash, and likely to exhaust it very quickly. And so I do regard October 18th as a deadline. It would be catastrophic to not pay the government's bills, for us to be in a position where we lack the resources to pay the government's bills. It really undermines confidence in the full faith and credit of the United States, our willingness to stand behind our debts and make sure that we pay them. And when you think about the impact it could have on 50 million seniors that are expecting Social Security checks, on our troops, on 30 million households waiting to receive their child tax credit payments, and these would be delayed, and the delays would grow longer. And of course, our debt itself, U.S. Treasury securities have long been viewed as the safest asset on the planet, that partly accounts for the reserve status of the dollar, and placing that in question by failing to pay any of our bills that come due would really be a catastrophic outcome.
I recognize...
I fully expect it would cause a recession as well.
I recognize that this is ultimately going to be the responsibility of the Senate and the House. But let me ask you this. Senator McConnell did put it on there, put the responsibility on the Speaker of the House and the Senate Democratic leader yesterday. And then Senator Manchin yesterday said maybe the approach in terms of the tools that are available should be reconciliation, that Democrats should do it in reconciliation. Would you support that?
Well, Andrew, I support getting it done. This has long been done on a bipartisan basis. The debt ceiling has been raised almost 80 times since 1960, and almost always on a bipartisan basis. This shouldn't be the responsibility of one party or the other. We have to raise the debt ceiling as a routine matter whenever the country runs budget deficits. And with the exception of a few years in the late 1990s, this has happened during most of the post-war period. And it should be routine to raise it. When bills are passed and tax policy is put in place, that's the right time to debate what the fiscal policy of this country should be. And we have those debates. But once decisions are made, we have to pay the bills that come from those decisions. And so to place an arbitrary ceiling on our debt and to create periodic crises, manufactured crises that really place our economy and our financial system at risk, especially now that we're recovering from the pandemic in a fragile way. I consider this irresponsible. I believe that both parties have a responsibility to get this done, and it's really up to the Congress to decide how to manage it, but I believe it must be done.
So, Chairman Powell, I know it's the policy of the Federal Reserve to not comment on fiscal policy, but fiscal policy does impact the Fed's economic projection, does it not?
Yes, it does. We make assumptions about fiscal policy, and then once it's enacted, we would put that into our models.
Okay, but your public models are a statement about current law rather than proposed policy. Is that largely correct?
Well, when we don't really publish a forecast as the Federal Reserve. Individual participants publish their forecasts in the Summary of Economic Projections, but that would include their personal assessments of likely fiscal actions.
Okay. So about these fiscal actions, Secretary Yellen, I said this in my opening statement, and I'll say this to both of you again. I am grateful as an American that you both are in the seats that you're in right now, because we're in a special circumstance here in the fall of this year. It was a foreseeable, slow-moving disaster, but here we are. But your credibility of your relative agencies and the credibility of you two individuals is of substance right now and very important to us as an American government. So, Secretary Yellen, you said in July, right before the debt limit was reinstated, the CBO said Treasury would probably run out of cash sometime in the first quarter of next year, or the fiscal year, most likely in October or November. Secretary Yellen, you began exercising Treasury's authority to take extraordinary measures to prevent a default back in August. Is that correct?
Yes, the debt limit, this suspension expired on August 1st, and we began using extraordinary measures to remain under the debt ceiling.
But those extraordinary measures are just a Band-Aid for a period of time, right?
Well, as I indicated, we expect them to be exhausted on October 18th.
Okay. And it would be a disaster if we did not.
It would be a
raise the debt limit.
catastrophe if Congress failed to raise the debt ceiling.
So here's the deal for Republicans. Democrats control the House and the Senate and the White House. And since January 20th, the approach of this Congress is that they do not need Republican votes to do anything. That's been the approach. And now they want the political cover in the midst of this massive amount of new spending to have Republicans raise the debt ceiling. That's really the request. So here's my question to you, Secretary Yellen. For the seat you sit in, do you care whether or not the debt limit is raised with Republican votes, or do you just care if it's raised?
I think it's important that this be done on a bipartisan basis. I think it should be bipartisan in recognition of the fact that both Republican administrations and Congresses and Democratic ones have run budget deficits for most of the post-war period, with only a few years serving as an exception. And that requires, on a regular basis, raising the debt ceiling. It is not about the need to do so, has nothing to do with future spending or tax plans that haven't been enacted.
So in this circumstance,
it's necessary to pay our bills.
I understand,
and
Secretary Yellen.
That's something that Republicans and Democrats need to share that responsibility.
Secretary Yellen, as I said to you on the phone last week, I've been a part of every single debt ceiling increase for the last decade, every fiscal consequence of Congress, and some of them have been very bad, but I've tried to make things better. I've been a part of the solution for the last decade. And the call that I received from you last week was the first outreach I've had from this administration to do something on a bipartisan basis. And you called me to raise the debt ceiling, not with a plan, not for a fiscal plan, not for my buy-in, but simply for my vote. And that, to me, speaks volumes. Now, I'm grateful for the outreach from you, but it speaks to the larger issue for the administration. And I don't envy the position you're in. I don't. Because the bad strategy from this White House and the leadership of this House and the Senate is showing they don't want Republican votes. We did bipartisan bills last Congress, and in the midst of COVID, bipartisan bills, major bipartisan bills. We can work together in a responsible manner, but to ask for my vote the week before it comes up in the House is not in keeping with the realities of the situation. Well, we have the tools, we have the votes to get this thing done through Congress. It's just a question of who votes for it.
I would like to point out that in 2017, when the White House and both houses of Congress were controlled by Republicans and a reconciliation bill was in progress that led to the 2017 tax cuts, the debt ceiling was raised, and it was done in a bipartisan basis.
Senator Reid, Senator Crapo of Idaho is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Secretary Yellen, some appear to believe that you have announced that unless a debt limit increase or suspension occurs before December 15th, that the Treasury faces imminent default. That's not how I've read your comments. So it would be helpful for you to clarify what your current projection is for when Treasury would run out of headroom to operate below the debt limit and run dangerously low of operating cash. I also request that Treasury provide details of its latest debt and cash projections to the Finance Committee and look forward to receiving those projections.
Yes, let me clarify what I said. What I indicated in my most recent letter to Congress is that I have a high degree of confidence the Treasury will be able to finance the U.S. government through December 15th, but there would be scenarios in which Treasury would not have sufficient funds to continue to finance the operations of the U.S. government beyond that date. I would note that on December 15th, Treasury will invest funds from the infrastructure bill, and that will use up $118 billion worth of capacity when those funds are from the Highway Trust Fund are invested in government securities. And I didn't say that there is no way that we can make it past December 15th. There are a range, there's uncertainty about what our cash balance will be and our resources. Right now, there's uncertainty about where we will be on December 15th. And there are scenarios in which we can see it would not be possible to finance the government. That doesn't mean that there are not also scenarios in which we can, but we think it's important for Congress to recognize that we may not be able to, and therefore to raise the debt ceiling expeditiously.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for that clarification. Chair Powell, inflation hit 6.2% last month, which is the highest in more than 3 decades. Still, the administration is pushing for support of a nearly $2 trillion social spending package. And by the way, that number even accepts their budget gimmicks that hide real costs that could mean several trillion more in spending over the next 10 years. Most of that spending does nothing to ameliorate the problems of rising inflation. In fact, will simply add fuel to the inflation fire. I'm very concerned that the administration is not taking inflation's threat seriously, and in the case of energy prices, is enacting regulatory policies that themselves are threats. Do you agree that inflation is a serious threat to our economy, and how do you intend to address inflation?
So I do think that the threat of persistently higher inflation has grown. I think my baseline expectation is still, as I mentioned, and of most forecasters, is still that inflation will move back down over the course of next year closer to our target. But clearly the risk of more persistent inflation has risen. And I think what you've seen is you've seen our policy adapt, and you'll see it continue to adapt. You know, we will use our tools to make sure that higher inflation does not become entrenched.
I noted in your opening statement that you indicated that inflation pressures will linger well into next year. You do stand by that?
Yes, I think we can now see certainly through the middle of next year. That's an expectation. You know, we're forecasting is not a perfect art, as you may have noticed. But yes, right into the middle of next year, and you know, that's our expectation. But of course, what's happened is that date has been pushed out repeatedly as supply side problems have not really improved.
And if Congress were to pass an additional $2 trillion plus in spending, mixed with a number of increases in taxes, would that add to inflationary pressures?
Senator, I'm sorry I'll just just note that we have a longstanding policy of not commenting on active legislation, as you probably aren't surprised to hear.
I suspected that. One last very quick question, and for you, Chair Powell, you've indicated that there would be a report by the Fed on its discussion paper relating to digital currencies, and that's been delayed several times. My question to you is, when can we expect the Fed's report, and are there reasons for that delay?
I would think very soon. I mean, it's certainly in coming weeks, and the reasons are just trying to get it right and trying to find the time to get it right. It's been a very busy time, as you will know.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Kraft. Senator Warner, Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's good to see you, Secretary Yellen, and congratulations, Chair Powell.
Hello, this is Christopher Israel, and thank you for listening to this commentary. Today, I would like to discuss the collapse of the United States dollar, the future of the American economy, and the slow degradation of the Anglo-American Empire. Now, normally when I talk to people about the potentiality, the potential of a US dollar collapse, usually they're like, "Oh, you're a conspiracy theorist, Stefan. Oh, this is all fear porn. You're just making things up. The dollar is the world reserve currency, and it's the safest currency in the world to conduct trade in." And yes, all this stuff is true and this and that. Well, not all of that is true, but the part about the United States dollar basically being the world reserve currency is true. And it is it has been up until now, and continues to be up at this point relatively, but not as much as it used to be, a safe currency and a trusted currency worldwide to conduct trade in. But according to Janet Yellen, as you guys saw in the beginning of this clip, things are changing or could potentially change. Now, if you don't know who Janet Yellen is, you probably should, because she's Secretary of the Treasury and also was chairman of the Federal Reserve from 2014 to 2018. Now, basically, Janet Yellen is the most powerful woman in America because she controls the creation of currency. What is the Federal Reserve? Most people know. And for those who don't, the Federal Reserve is the United States Central Bank. They issue the currency, the greenback, that most people use in their daily lives to buy goods and services and participate in the American economy. Now, America has been on the dollar system for many, many years, since the creation of the Federal Reserve Bank in 1917. And so it's been basically about 100 years that the United States has had a central bank issuing the creation of its currency. But now it seems like the American dollar system is coming to an end. And really, to understand what this means, you got to look at human history, and you got to look at the history of currencies and civilizations. Most people know that, well, it wasn't always that people or human beings traded paper currencies or fiat currencies for goods and services. It used to be that you would just trade one commodity for another commodity. Like, for example, I don't know, one goat for 3 shekels of silver or whatever it's worth. And people used to trade gold and silver, or just things for other things. It didn't even have to necessarily be a money commodity. People would find different items of value in exchange for whatever they felt was worth, depending on the economic situations of the various countries involved, etc., etc. But then as nation states started to industrialize, banking was introduced, and fiat currencies became the most efficient currency used for trading. among different societies. And usually every society has its own central bank that issues its own fiat currency. And then as people continued to progress into the digital age, we started to issue digital currencies like Bitcoin and other things like that. But not just that, even just think of like the money in your bank account as digital currency. Because basically it is. It's just like a number on a screen on your bank account, but it's not really cash, right? You can withdraw cash or you could not. You could spend the money in your account and it's entirely digital, see? And that's the way that they're trying to move things forward now, to abolish cash and whatnot and just have everyone's financial transactions on one centralized digital currency controlled by the United States Central Bank. Well, hopefully, if they can pull it off. But of course, they won't be able to because there's too many competing digital currencies like cryptos, Bitcoin, Ethereum, Litecoin, Dogecoin. So, in essence, we're living in a unique time period where the power of the world's central banks are waning and being challenged. And Janet Yellen issuing her warning sign about the debt ceiling, I think, is a red flag to the world that the United States dollar system, well, it's probably going bye-bye at this point. Now, the reason I made this video is because I think it's just important to talk about. I don't really see a lot of people like in society really talking about the status of our currency, the future of it, how things are changing. I mean, you see it like here and there, but it's not really the main focus of conversation nowadays. Most people are really talking about whether or not they should get vaccinated. Now, normally at this point, I assume most people are thinking, hold on, Stefan, all this is conjecture. I mean, just 3 YouTube videos of Janet Yellen talking about, oh, we could potentially lose the status of the dollar, of the world reserve currency, if they don't raise the debt ceiling in Congress. Does that really prove that the dollar is on a potential path to collapse? Well, that on its own, of course not. But luckily, I've been getting smarter over the years, or really, I should say, over the past 6 months to 2 years, or 2 years to 6 months. And I've been reading books on this subject and others, and specifically this subject. There is a book called De-dollarization, the revolt against the dollar and the rise of a new financial order, written by Luft and Anne Korin. Luft and Anne Korin are co-directors of Washington, D.C.-based Institute for the Analysis of Global Security. Basically, that's all short for some pro-war deep state CIA goons in Washington. Regardless of the political affiliations of the authors, this book is very informative for those who want to understand or have a deep dive into the geopolitical situation surrounding the United States dollar and the American economy in relation to empire and central banking. So I'd like to read a couple pages from this book just to give the audience a better understanding of the political situation unfolding in America today. The question, who will run the world in the 21st century, would likely not have sufficed if not for a growing sense that the current superpower, the United States of America, is losing its mojo. While it is still the world's biggest economy, the strongest military power, and the pillar of the rules-based international order, the United States is more divided, unfocused, and indifferent to the world than at any point since the Second World War. The fact that no great power, not even China, is capable of stepping into America's big shoes only adds to the sense of confusion. Time will tell if what we are experiencing today is a temporary funk or the beginning of Pax Americana's long goodbye and the transition to what Ian Bremmer and David Gordon have called a G0 world. in which Western influence is replaced by a vacuum, and every nation is more or less for itself. The next few years will be America's opportunity to ensure the former is the answer. There is much to be done on multiple fronts. This book offers a glimpse into a strategic development that has received little notice in the United States domestic public conversation, yet, if ignored, could drive America's decline like no other. It has to do with our currency. For now, the world's currency, the United States dollar. The dollar is the foundation of the United States economy, and a key element of America's preeminence by virtue of its special status as the reserve currency of the world. The United States is home to less than 5% of the world's population and accounts for a fifth of the world's GDP, yet 80% of international payments are made in its currency. This makes the dollar our national symbol and the world's most familiar brand. And one way or another, we are all beholden to it. If the dollar were to lose its special status as the reserve currency of the world, the impact would be felt not only in our pocketbooks, our retirement plans, our healthcare costs, the value of our homes, and our bank loans, but also in America's ability to preserve its superpower status. This is not a hypothetical scenario. In our increasingly chaotic world, the dollar is facing a challenge by a growing coalition of states and non-state actors who are fed up with what they believe to be America's overuse of sanctions and other coercive economic measures, its extraterritorial legal outreach, and its treatment of the global financial system as its fiefdom. Through a variety of tactics, some stealth, others up front, those actors seek to rewrite the rules of the 21st century, and that includes challenging the dollar's hegemony over the world's monetary system. Their effort to undermine the dollar is intensifying by the day as more and more players jump on the bandwagon, moving their trades to non-dollar currencies and building mechanisms to circumvent the United States-dominated financial system. It is only recently that the term de-dollarization has begun to appear in our public conversation, and like other new, slow-moving threats, it has drawn mixed responses, ranging from dismal to alarm. Optimists view the effort to dethrone the dollar as yet another shenanigan by a group of tin pot dictators whose primary interest is to evade sanctions, launder money, wreak havoc on the international system, and further America's decline. The dollar system is robust, they claim, and the attacks on it are, at most, inconsequential pinpricks. Pessimists, on the other hand, see a violent storm gathering on the horizon. For them, America, crushed under the burden of unsustainable debt and extracting itself from the globalized system, is on a path of irreversible decline, and the fall of the dollar system is the inevitable manifestation of this decline. This view is no longer held only by fringe economists, but by some mainstream and highly respected financial institutions. For example, in July 2019, J.P. Morgan strategist Craig Hogan wrote in a note to investors, "We believe the dollar could lose its status as the world's dominant currency, which could see it depreciate over the medium term due to structural reasons as well as cyclical impediments. It is not given to us to foresee who is correct, as is often the case in such debates over the long run. At some point, each of the sides will be right. But then, as John Maynard Keynes said, in the long run, we are all dead." As this book is being written, America's near-term economic indicators look fairly good. Equity markets are thriving. Consumer confidence is high. Unemployment has fallen to historical low levels, and the dollar is holding well against the currencies that could potentially challenge it. More so, the instability in Europe has created uncertainty about the future of the euro, which is celebrating at the time of this writing its 20th anniversary, and this could spell trouble for the world's second most widely traded currency. If the eurozone were to break, this could buy the dollar for quite some time. The other major currencies all have their problems, and they are not performing much better. On its face, the dollar is unrivaled, but the surface level calm and other countries' travails should not distract us from the deep-rooted problems the United States is facing. We are increasing our national debt at an unsustainable pace, while the number of governments, institutions, and individuals who reject America's international conduct, and particularly its financial policing, is growing by the day. Left unattended, the pushback against the dollar will gather more steam as more countries reclaim their sovereignty and opt to diversify their currency portfolios. And while each singular action may seem inconsequential, cumulatively, the effects could ultimately cause death by 1,000 cuts. It would be imprudent to ignore the warning signs described in this book. On the other hand, panic is also unwarranted. The dollar is not likely to lose its special status tomorrow morning or next year. One should not underestimate the reputation, resilience, and transparency of the American financial system, not to mention the strength of the dollar brand. What gives the dollar its strength is the faith in the stability and continuity of the American political system and America's uncontested military power. While many countries grumble about our conduct and some turn their backs on our rules-based order altogether, there are many who will cherish the status quo authorized by the United States almost a century ago, and who are ready to fight for its preservation. Those fellow travelers should not be taken for granted. The de-dollarization effort of several countries described in the coming chapters are interesting, but in the grand scheme of things, most of them bear little consequence for the United States. It is hard to see how a bunch of internationally isolated second or third tier economies like Russia, Iran, or Venezuela, even if working in concert, could topple the gigantic and widely accepted dollar system. But there is one country that can dramatically change this calculus: China. We would not have written this book if not for the historical transformation of United States-China relations unfolding right before our very eyes. United States relations with China are presently at a historical junction. Every 40 years after the beginning of the United States-China economic engagement, it is apparent that the relations are no longer complementary. The two countries, representing two diametrically opposed political, economic, and social systems, yet economically intertwined like conjoined twins, are locked in a trade war with a fierce struggle over the 21st century technological superiority. It is yet to be seen if China and the United States are headed towards an era of strategic adjustment in which a new path to coexistence is chartered, or if they are headed towards a full-blown Cold War 2.0. Which could eventually decouple the two economies, if not worse. While both scenarios would add a great deal of instability to the world economy, the latter would have profound and multi-generational consequences for humanity. Should we end up in this direction, it can be assumed that China, a top holder of America's foreign debt, will spare no effort to de-dollarize not only its own economic system, but that of its entire sphere of influence, if not the whole world. This new world order, born out of Cold War 2.0, would give rise to China-Russia-led parallel financial universe, which would compete with the dollar system, forcing all other nations, including some of America's closest allies, to make difficult choices. To assess how serious of a risk de-dollarization poses to America's future, both in the near term and the longer term, we will explore the motives of each of the main players compromising what we call the dollar insurgency, listening to the viewpoints and grievances of policymakers, academics, bankers, and business people in China, Russia, Europe, South Asia, Middle East. Many of the complaints about the United States may not correspond with the way most Americans view themselves and their role in the world, but familiarity with the other side's thinking is critical for assessing the risk and crafting an effective response. Once we understand the insurgents' motives, we will cover the means they have at their disposal to advance their goal. And this we will view their domestic monetary policies, their geoeconomic rationale, and their views about unilateralization of multinational organizations and financial mechanisms. We also describe attempts to utilize the global oil market as a lever by shifting more oil transactions from dollars to alternative currencies. We view the oil market as the dollar's first line of defense. If it succumbs to the de-dollarization movement, the rest of the multi-trillion-dollar global commodity market will follow, draining hundreds of billions of dollars from the dollar circuit. We then move on to assess how the changes in technology, geopolitics, and multinational organizations and corporations, including America's own Facebook, which recently announced the introduction of its own currency, are shaping the new monetary order of the 21st century. So that was just a brief introduction from the book De-dollarization. And from that summary, basically you could surmise that, or I'll basically elaborate that the United States is basically receiving pushback against its currency. So the United States is basically the world reserve currency. And the reason for that, you have to go back all the way to 1947, I believe, during what was called the Bretton Woods Conference. And this was an arrangement that was made by a group of bankers worldwide that the United States would basically be the world reserve currency of the world because the rest of the world was destroyed after World War II. And basically they had no infrastructure and they needed a reliable currency for trade to rebuild their countries. So if I could just follow up by reading a couple pages from the book Petro-Dollar Warfare, Oil, Iraq, and the Future of the Dollar, written by William R. Clark. The dollar is the symbol of U.S. economic power and the center for the world's financial markets and the foundation upon which the American century was built. However, since early 2002, the international capital markets have developed a notable preference for the euro. Washington appears to have abandoned a strong dollar policy and allowed the dollar to fall without intervention, other than that of the Japanese. The public comments from Washington are that the markets should decide the value of the dollar. A careful analysis of the nuances of international finance reveals what is actually taking place is a high-stakes game for geopolitical influence. We are witnessing a struggle between two competing global currencies, the euro and the dollar. The emergence of the euro has provided the first viable challenger to the United States dollar supremacy since the end of World War II. The Bush administration's drive toward a war in Iraq was represented not only by highly visible neoconservative hawks such as Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, and Richard Pearl, but also by the more powerful and veiled interests whose global role depends upon the dollar's status as the world reserve currency. These influential groups are well represented by cabinet members of the Bush administration and include large transnational energy companies such as Halliburton, ExxonMobil, Chevron, Texaco. The other half of these influential interests are the big five American defense conglomerates of Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, and TRW, as well as numerous other military industrial contractors. These giant energy and military firms wield enormous political clout in Washington, often hiring former Washington insiders to enhance their political power. Cheney's tenure as CEO of Halliburton between the two Bush administrations is the most well-known example of the powerful government-energy nexus. This is the same corporate military industrial petroleum network of conglomerates that preferred a puppet government in Iraq for reasons that will become apparent later in this chapter. And the high-stakes game of geostrategy, maintaining the dollar as the world reserve currency, was a major component in the Bush administration's push for the Iraq War. Once this fundamental concept is known, the strategic and political divisions between the United States and the EU Franco-German alliances in both the pre-war and post-war periods become understandable. America's dominant position as the sole superpower ultimately rests upon two pillars: its overwhelming military superiority and its control of the global economic system by the unique role of the dollar as the world reserve currency. An analysis of the facts before, during, and especially after the Iraq War strongly suggests it was designed to preserve the second pillar of U.S. domination, the dollar, and its unique role regarding international oil sales. Even before World War II and America's emergence as a superpower, the United States had a large economy, but at the time it was not a leading factor in global management. In 1929, before the Great Depression, the United States produced a prodigious 44.5% of global industrial production compared to Germany's 11.6%, Great Britain's 9.3%, France's 7%, Soviet Union's 4.6%, and Japan's 2.4%. However, the aftermath of World War II dramatically reinforced this dynamic, and the U.S. emerged as a superpower. During the war, its economy was transformed into a semi-command economy in which industrial production almost quadrupled. Women entered the workforce in vast numbers, while the American citizens made significant sacrifices in lifestyle and consumption for the war effort. By the end of the war, the United States had not only gained economic dominance, but also enjoyed greatly enhanced security in the northern and southern hemispheres. Following the successful D-Day invasion of June 1944, the Allies realized the war would probably end within a few years, and it was obvious the world would be in dire need of economic and diplomatic stabilization. This led to the famous Bretton Woods monetary conferences of 1944 to 1945 that established a new international monetary system based on the United States dollar. A plaque erected at the original conference site in Carroll, New Hampshire states, in 1944, the United States government chose the Mount Washington Hotel as the site for gathering of representatives of 44 countries. This was be the famed Bretton Woods Monetary Conference. The conference established the World Bank, set the gold standard at $35 an ounce, and chose the American dollar as the backbone of international exchange. The meeting provided the world with badly needed post-war currency stability. This arrangement worked rather well for the world for many years, but it came to an end because of America's escalation in Vietnam. They printed dollars to finance the war, as explained. The first, most benign and prosperous phase of the American century came to an end by the early 1970s. This due in part to the escalating expenses of the Vietnam War and the growing economic strength of Europe and Japan was greatly exacerbated by the unexpected arrival of domestic peak oil production in the lower 48 United States in 1970. By the mid-1960s, the Bretton Woods gold exchange began to break down as Europe had rebuilt its manufacturing base and had become a strong exporter. One visible example of renewed economic power was Volkswagen automobile sales in the United States. This growing economic strength in Western Europe coincided with soaring United States public deficits as President Johnson escalated the tragic war in Vietnam. Given the huge debt being created by the military operations in Southeast Asia, several European countries became concerned about the dollar's value and began redeeming their dollars for gold. The most notable was Charles de Gaulle of France, the first of the major European countries to take its dollar exports, earnings, and claim gold from the United States Federal Reserve, which was legal under the Bretton Woods Conference. However, by November 1967, withdrawals of gold bullion from the United States Treasury had become extensive. The weak link in the Bretton Woods gold exchange arrangement was Britain, often referred to as the sick man of Europe. It broke the first link in the Bretton Woods monetary system in 1967 when the pound sterling was devalued. This accelerated the pressure on the United States dollar as French and other central banks increased their calls for United States gold in exchange for their dollar reserves. They calculated with soaring war deficits from Vietnam it was only a matter of months before the United States itself would be forced to devalue it against gold, so better to get their gold out at a high price. By summer of 1971, the drain of the Federal Reserve's gold stocks had become critical, and even the Bank of England joined in the French in demanding U.S. gold bullion for their dollars. In August 1971, the British ambassador showed up to the Treasury Department to redeem $3 billion for its fixed exchange value of gold, $35 per ounce, approximately 5.3 million ounces, or 2,600 tons of gold. At this time, the Nixon administration opted to abandon the dollar-gold link entirely, thereby going to a system of floating currencies on August 11, 1971. Otherwise, Nixon would have risked the collapse of the gold reserves of the United States. Rather than risk damaging the United States credit, he changed the rules, or more accurately, he abandoned the rules. The break with gold effectively ended the Bretton Woods Agreement and opened the door to an entirely new phase of the American century. In this phase, large international banks such as Citibank, Chase, Manhattan, or Barclays Bank in effect privatized control over monetary policy. These institutions assumed a role that central banks held under the Bretton Woods gold system, but of course without any ability to redeem dollars for gold. In this phase, market forces determined the dollar's value, which resulted in substantial inflation during the 1970s. In an effort to stem this inflation, the Nixon administration adopted wage price freezing in 1971, but inflation continued to increase significantly during the 1970s. The Nixon administration began high-level talks with Saudi Arabia to unilaterally price international oil sales in dollars only, despite U.S. assurances to its European and Japanese allies that such a unique monetary geopolitical arrangement would not transpire. In 1974, an agreement was reached with New York and London banking interests that established what became known as Petro-Dollar recycling. That year, the Saudi government secretly purchased $2.5 billion in U.S. Treasury bills with their oil surplus funds, and a few years later, Treasury Secretary Blumenthal cut a secret deal with the Saudis to ensure that OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Nations, would continue to price oil in dollars only. The petrodollar supremacy phase was a successful attempt by the United States ruling establishment to slow down its geopolitical decline as the hegemonic power of the post-war system. The IMF Washington Consensus enforced draconian debt collection on developing countries, forcing them to repay dollar debts despite the social upheavals and lack of funds for domestic growth. Moreover, this system prevented economic independence from developing nations in our hemisphere and kept the United States banks and the dollar afloat. During the first 5 decades of World War II, American dominance was largely based on the understanding that the United States would provide certain services to its allies, such as military security or regulating world markets, that would benefit both the larger group and itself. This period was marked with a sufficient degree of American multilateralism within the UN framework and international cooperation between the United States and Europe regarding NATO military operations. However, unlike a dominant power that enjoys some level of acquiescence from other nation states, an imperial power has no obligations to allies, nor does it have the freedom for such policies, as the only raw dictate becomes how to hold on to its declining power, often referred to as imperial overreach. This is the worldview that neoconservatives such as Dick Cheney and Rumsfeld advocate. Nothing less than United States domination of the international order. This requires the doctrine of preventative warfare, military control over the world's primary energy supply, along with military enforcement of the dollar and only the dollar as the international currency standard for oil transactions. Unlike the previous periods of United States domination, forward-leaning military unilateralism is the underlying posture. An unspoken war between the dollar and the euro for global supremacy is at the heart of this new phase of the American century, referred to in this text as the petrodollar warfare stage. As previously noted, the crucial shift to an oil-backed currency took place in the early 1970s when President Nixon closed the so-called gold window at the Federal Treasury. This removed the dollar's redemption value from a fixed amount of gold to a fiat currency that floated against other currencies. This was done so the federal government would have no restraints on printing new dollars, thereby able to pursue undisciplined fiscal policies to maintain the United States superpower status. The only limit was how many dollars the rest of the world would be willing to accept on the full faith and credit of the United States government. The result was rapid inflation and a falling dollar. Although rarely debated outside arcane discussions of the global political economy, it is easy to grasp that if oil can be purchased on the international markets only with US dollars, the demand and liquidity value will be solidified, given that oil is the essential natural resource for every industrialized nation. Oil trades are the basic enablers of a manufacturing infrastructure, the basis of global transportation, and the primary energy source for 40% of the industrialized economy. During the 1970s, a two-pronged strategy was pursued by the United States and United Kingdom banking elites to exploit the unique role of oil in an effort to maintain dollar hegemony. One component was the requirement that OPEC agree to price and conduct all of its oil transactions in the dollar only, and the second was to use these surplus petrodollars as an instrument to dramatically reverse the dollar's falling international value via high oil prices. The net effect solidified industrialized and developing nations under the sphere of the dollar. No longer backed by gold, the dollar became backed by black gold. So, in summary, basically, the United States dollar is propped up by the oil market in the Persian Gulf in the Middle East region. This was done in the 1970s to ensure that the United States would remain the sole superpower. But after aggressive American policies in different Middle East countries and sanctions on developing nations as well as sanctions on Russia and China, the rest of the world has become fed up with the United States military and economic policy. Basically, our decision to unilaterally wage war on any nation we so desire, coupled with the decision of Washington to sanction basically whoever the fuck they want, and coupled with the Federal Reserve, central bank, and their quantitative easing policies of just printing trillions of dollars and debasing the currency, the rest of the world realized that they have to break free of the American dollar system in order to gain their own economic sovereignty and independence. And that's what I believe is happening today. Or not today as in literally today, but as you can surmise, that was a euphemism. In this time period, this administration, what have you, the next 5 to 10 years, we will probably see the collapse of the dollar system. And as this book is titled, The Rise of a New Financial World Order. What does this mean for me, an average American citizen? Well, I'm going to stack up my gold and silver. And, well, I can't really afford gold, but copper and silver. If I can afford one gold coin one day, that would be a blessing from Hashem. Because I believe personally that, and I think history has proven, silver, gold, bronze are a great way to protect the wealth and a great store of wealth and a hedge against inflation. I've also been betting against the dollar in a private stock account that I have with Robinhood. I suggest the layman also invest with Robinhood if you can. It's pretty useful investing tool. And I feel like betting against the dollar with different like companies that invest in precious metals and renewable energies is a great way to protect my wealth. Now, the future is pretty uncertain and I don't know what's going to happen, but I don't want anybody to fall into complete despair because there's still hope. And with the will of Hashem, we will get through this as a nation. But unfortunately, we are going to have to confront many of the sins of the past and really dark revelations about our society and look at ourselves in a different way. Consumerism, what was it all for? You understand what I'm saying? They printed these dollars and basically forced the dollar system on Iraq and Syria and Libya and all these other countries that don't want to use the dollar or sell their oil in dollars, but they use the military and go to war, indiscriminately kill civilians and bomb nations in order to prop up the empire. And no one really wants to look at their country as some sort of genocidal, tyrannical government that dominates the world and steals resources and sanctions war crimes. But sometimes the reality is just that dark, and we just got to accept it in order to improve things, or else we're just going to be consumed and left behind, because nobody just wants to be continuously bombed by America or sanctioned by America, and that's just the reality of it. I think I'm going to end the commentary here. If you made it this far, thanks for listening. I did not intend for this to be this long. I'm going to have to record more gameplay footage just to compensate for the length of this commentary. But, hey, I mean, I got it done, and God willing, hopefully this information will help people. Thank you for listening to this commentary. God bless, and have a great day. I would like to pray to my God Adonai for Mishe Barak and healing, for anyone who has lost a loved one, all those who are suffering tragedies, all those who are sick or in need of healing. Please, Hashem, heal this nation and help people get through any sort of hardships that they are going through in life at this time. Amen.
Required in West Industrial.
Playing the hottest hip-hop on the streets. It's the Going Brother #1, Mr. C.
Suspect southbound.